The control tower looked like a lighthouse that had forgotten the sea. Concrete bones, sun-bled glass, and a rusted staircase spiraling up its throat. Nayla Quaid stood at the base with the deed folded in her back pocket, the wind lifting her hair and blowing the smell of old rain out from the broken doorway. People in the town of Greyvault called it the birdcage. They called her the girl who inherited a perch with no wings. She touched the cool concrete with the back of her fingers and felt the way abandoned places hold on to weather like memory. Her uncle's signature, Osric Quaid's looping hand, was still wet in her mind from the lawyer's office that morning. He had left her this: 61 acres of mothballed airfield and a control tower no one had entered in a decade. The clerk at the county office laughed and asked if she wanted to list it in the odd properties showcase. Radio masts, storm-bent sheds, strange debts with a cheeky note about views. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. Nayla tasted metal, the way she always did when she stood at the edge of a choice. She had walked away from a tidy life 2 counties over, systems engineer by day, caretaker of her sister's cloudy grief by night, a woman who pretended that avoidance was a form of mercy. She had driven into Greyvault under a sky like unstruck pewter and parked at the foot of this tower that people said only birds and rumor used anymore. The front door was a sheet of corrugated tin wedged in place with a fieldstone. Someone had scratched Quail Hotel across it in paint the color of old tea. She nudged it aside with her hip and stepped into cool dark that smelled like dust and oxidized wire. Her eyes adjusted. A stairwell ribbed with shadow, a landing lamp dangling like a question, a scuffed sign bolted to the wall. Elevator out of service since always. "Birdcage!" a voice called from outside, teenage, delighted, cruel in the way only amused strangers can be. "Hey, birdcage girl, you got any peanuts for the flock?" Greyvault had a way of carrying sound, across scrub, through the husk of hangars, so laughter from the road arrived in waves. She didn't turn back. Curiosity would never leave her alone if she did. The staircase rasped under her boots. She climbed. She climbed past a nest made of baling twine and shredded plastic bags, past graffiti lilies blooming where panels had peeled. There were places in the steps where the metal sang its fatigue when she put weight down. She listened and adjusted her cadence like one pilot listening to another on an old frequency. "Who inherits a dead tower?" the cafe owner asked an hour earlier as she slid a coffee the color of judgment across to Nayla. "Baby, you can't eat a view." "I don't want to eat it." She had watched steam coil and decided to own the strangeness before it owned her. "I want to climb it." "Climb it and do what?" "I don't know yet. See from above, I guess." She had surprised herself with that honesty. She had meant to say fix it up, maybe rent it to some artist who loved rust, but the truth felt clearer. She needed altitude. She needed a perspective that wasn't compromised by the angle of her old life. At the top, the door into the cab was jammed. She put her shoulder against it and pushed until it gave with a groan. Light poured over her like revelation, a 360-degree ring of glass rimed with salt and the immodest view of everything. The retired runway like a gray spine, the hangars slumped like tired oxen, the town's ribbon of shops, the low, flammable scrub running out to the dark stitches of sea and river. Above it all hung sky, the big, indifferent kind that made ordinary hearts feel both smaller and braver. The consoles sat like ancient altars, dust-bloomed radar screens, a bank of radios wearing their age openly, a metal stool with a ripped cushion and a ring of old coffee stains around its feet. A map was still pinned to the corkboard on the western wall. Airspace, corridors, names she didn't know but wanted to. Between the pins, an old pencil line had been drawn over and over like someone practicing a signature. When she ran her fingers over the radio's dials, they clicked with that satisfying resistance that told her there were still bones inside this carcass. "Hello?" she said into the empty cab, because sometimes you have to say a room's name out loud to make it yours. Her voice sounded like it had altitude now. She smiled despite herself and began to take inventory, the way she did with every system she ever met, cataloging without judgment. 2 VHF transceivers, one still lit when she flipped the switch, a battered handheld with a chewed antenna, a drawer full of grease pencils, a logbook whose last entry scrawled, "Final light test. May 18th, good luck." She stood with the logbook open, her thumb holding Osric's last pages like she could keep him from leaving a second time. She had known him as a shape at family gatherings, a tall man who smelled of machine oil and Fjord soap, who always sat with his back to a wall and his eyes on a window. When he'd called her last winter, she'd let it go to voicemail. She'd kept that voice all the same. Now it echoed in the high room between the radios and the map and her throat. "Gray Vault Tower, this is Osric on the ground. If you ever come out here, kid, bring a flashlight and a stubborn heart," his recorded voice had said back then, laughter folded into the vowels. "I brought both," she whispered now, and felt her composure tilt. Then she steadied herself, set the logbook down gently, and began to clean. The first day in a place full of neglect is a day of small, righteous victories. A pane of glass coaxed clear with vinegar and newsprint, a path cleared across the console with a painter's brush, the simple courage of setting a trash bag in a room that had forgotten containers were for hope. She opened the side windows so the wind could hurry out the air that had been standing too long. Out beyond the runway, a flock of souls turned like a single thought. Footsteps clanged on the stairs. Nayla straightened, a grease pencil in her fist like a conductor's baton. The door jerked open and a boy about 16 stumbled in, cheeks windburned, hair that had never obeyed, a drone controller hanging from his neck like a medallion. He blinked. At her, then at the room like he'd discovered contraband. "Oh, hi. We take turns daring each other to get up here. Didn't think anyone actually," he gestured broadly at her tools, "claimed it." "It's already claimed," she said, trying out a tone that sounded like the tower, a little above, not unkind. "But you can come in if you promise not to fall, or break anything your mother can't afford." He grinned. "Don't have a mother who can afford anything. I got an auntie who'll make you regret existence if I step on a nail, though. I'm Owen." "Nayla." She bent back to the radio she'd been coaxing awake. "You fly?" "Drones." He lifted the controller. "Courier work for Ms. Lozano at the bait shop. Deliver sunglasses for the surf shop when their girl calls in with karaoke damage. Mostly I chase birds I swear I'm not chasing." "From the tower?" "From the world." He leaned on the console and peered out. "You gonna make this thing work again? Folks will talk. Half the town is sure the birdcage is haunted by pilots who missed places they never saw." "I'm making it honest again," she said before she realized she'd found the sentence, "so that when it speaks, it says true things." Owen nodded like that made sense. He pointed toward the horizon where the river met the sea. "Arclight's setting up another convoy at the North Pier. You can see the trucks line up from here. Looks organized, like ants when they're certain the sugar is theirs." Nayla squinted. A thin chain of white rectangles inched along a ribbon of road like pearls on a grim necklace. Gray Vault had lost industries the way some people lose teeth. One by one, it got harder to smile. The consortium buying up pieces of waterline promised jobs, promised to turn the mothballed airfield into a logistics campus with a glass front visitor center that would say STEAM to kids with nowhere to go. The council president had nearly levitated when he said it at the diner, hands framing renderings like offerings. "What do they move?" she asked. "Whatever fits in midnight," Owen said, eyes on the trucks. "They brought in prefab fences last week, the kind with barbs you add later when you stop pretending. They work quiet and late, like a secret taught how to wear work boots." Nayla turned the radio dial a fraction of a notch. Static blossomed, then thinned. Voices feathered the edges, coded chatter, someone calling numbers like a prayer for stability. Under it, she thought she heard something softer, a sound like wind over a bottle.
She didn't know what it was yet, but her body cataloged it the way a diver catalogs currents. Down in town, the afternoon heaved into evening. When she climbed down at last, palms black with old tower dust, the children were chalking constellations on the sidewalk like they were trying to bribe the night. At the cafe, Ms. Lozano, the owner with the tired bracelets and the kind scold, hollered from the doorway. "You the tower girl?" Nayla held up her hands and smiled, conceding, "That's me." A watchful old man at a corner table watched her with the fond suspicion of someone cataloging a new species. A couple in work boots glanced up and then back down. The cafe smelled like lemon oil and fry oil and the ghost of cinnamon rolls. Lozano slid a plate across the counter at her before she could fish for money. "You look like you argued with a chimney. Eat before you turn into philosophy." They kept their studies of her sociably frank, the way small towns do. "Where you from? What you want with that old thing? You hear they're gonna put in an incinerator out by the marsh? You single? You know what you're doing?" She answered what didn't bruise. "Systems engineer. A deed fell into my lap. I don't know yet. Not an incinerator, an energy recovery facility, the flyers say. Yes. Yes, but not the kind you mean." On her way out, a man in a pearl snap shirt leaned back on two legs of his chair and asked, "How much you want for the tower?" "It's not for sale." She kept her voice easy. "Everything's for sale," he smiled, without humor. "You'll learn." She didn't say what lived fluid and warm on her tongue. "I learned that already. You don't learn it twice." Back in the tower, night made the glass into mirrors. Her reflection looked like a woman trying very hard not to be the version of herself the room suggested. Lonely, willful, good at fixing things that don't say thank you. She set up a folding cot against the eastern wall, a battery lantern, a drink cooler. There are roofs you can't sleep under until you've made a bargain with what they've seen. She made hers by saying out loud the names of everyone she missed and promising the walls she would keep them out of her decisions. The radio kept breathing soft static like a sleeping thing. She tuned slowly, learning the hill's habits. Fishermen on marine VHF, laughing about weather they claimed not to believe in. A ham operator 3 towns over telling his wife through the air that the pill bottle in the cabinet over the stove was the one with the blue cap, not the green. Then a sharper voice cutting through on airband, a charter pilot from the city practicing pattern talk with himself to keep his voice honest. No one hailed Greyvault. The frequency was a ghost town with a street light still working. Toward midnight, she caught the bottle wind sound again, this time wearing a shape. It was a tone, just a blip, barely there, repeating on a whisper of carrier. If you'd asked her why it raised the small hairs on her arms, she wouldn't have a good word answer, but her body had been a tuned instrument ever since she was a girl who could tell which circuit was going to blow by the way the refrigerator motor complained. Owen's drone returned as a smudge at the window, red and green eyes blinking. He tapped the glass with the tip of a prop like a boy too shy to knock with his knuckles. She opened the hatch, and he clambered in with the drone cradled like a bird he loved too much to admit. "They moved again," he said, breathless from both climb and news. "The ArcLight trucks. They staged at the North Pier, then 2 peeled off and went to the Marsh Road where there's no reason to go unless your reason is shady. I saw them unload crates into a boathouse the county forgot they own." "Did you film?" "Course." He tapped his phone. "But from above it might. Bad guys look like regular guys who shop at the same store for flashlights. You can't film a feeling." "Sometimes you can. You just call it a pattern." Nayla pointed to the whiteboard she'd erased with her sleeve of her shirt. She'd drawn the town like a nervous system, piers as synapses, roads as arteries, the tower as a brain trusting its own faint misfires. She marked the convoy's path where Owen described it. If they're moving in a loop that doesn't make sense for fuel or convenience, then the loop is the point. Our councilman says they're doing us a favor, Owen said, unimpressed. Says empty buildings full of memory are expensive. Says there's a world out there where places like this have purpose. There is, but it doesn't require turning a marsh into an ashtray. He grinned, surprised by her bite. Are you from here, really? No, but I know a promise that phases out the poor when it hears itself. She adjusted the radio volume lower. Get home. Your aunt will release the hounds.
He didn't move. He looked out at the runway washed in moonlight. You think you can turn the lights back on? He asked softly, like asking if she could wake a sleeping parent without making them angry. I think the filaments might still have stubbornness left. She smiled at him. Go. When he'd left, she took the logbook to the console and found the page where Osric had drawn a little cartoon of himself with a lantern instead of a head. The entry beneath it was precise, unadorned. Relamped RWI 15/33. Beacon motor cleaned. Wind edge sparrows determined as ever. She laughed aloud, the sound rough with gratitude. Then she crawled under the console, where the main breaker lived, and opened it with the keys she'd found tucked into the logbook's spine. The brass had tarnished, but not surrendered. She traced circuits with a multimeter, their paths clean in her mind even where the lines were scabbed with age. It took 3 hours, and the patience she gave only machines and grief. When she was done, she felt the answer as a quiet in her bones. It could work. The old system wasn't dead so much as sulking. She set a hand on the master and hesitated. She thought of arcing wires shouting their protest down the hill into town, of Miss Lozano waking in her apartment behind the cafe and swearing abuela oaths at the way the sky changed. She thought of the council president driving past and deciding to turn the tower into a cudgel. She thought of the way people reached for comfort when things you thought were permanent revealed they were mostly faith. She flipped the switch. From the top of the tower, the beacon spun up slow and stubborn, then faster. Light swept the night in a patient circle. Down the runway, the edge lights stuttered like they'd been startled awake, then found their memory of shining. The airfield's spine glowed a dim, modest blue. In town, lights flicked on in one apartment, then 2. Dogs announced theological certainties to anyone who would listen. Nyla exhaled a laugh that felt like someone had adjusted a screw behind her ribs. She keyed the radio, a habit falling out of her fingers as if it had been waiting. Grey Vault traffic. This is Grey Vault Tower. Testing lights and beacon. She almost added, if anyone's listening. She didn't. Pride is a whisper. You don't shout it through a mic. Static answered like a cat deciding whether to come when called. She left the lights on for 10 minutes, then 20, then put them to sleep again so the night could hold itself properly. When she climbed down in the morning, her shoulders ached like she'd carried someone out of a burning house. At the cafe, the old man in the corner pointed his chin at her as if anointing. You lit the sky. Thought I was dying and heaven was being cheap. Miss Lozano slapped a dish towel at him. Don't say the word dying in my shop. It makes the muffins collapse. She handed Nyla a cinnamon roll on a plate she didn't deserve. Did you do that? The lights needed a little truth. I broke the roll in half and passed the larger half back. Half for house policy. It's whole for house policy when you wake a memory like that. Lozano's eyes were bright. My sister got engaged under those lights in '86 when they kept a little Cessna club here. She would have loved seeing them again. A cheerless man in an arc-light polo stopped at their table and smiled like a cashier who'd been informed of shoplifting and was required to be kind about it. Do you know it's illegal to energize a closed field? We don't want to confuse the airspace. He cocked his head. Wouldn't want someone trying to land where they shouldn't. I didn't invite ghosts, Nyla said evenly. I just confirmed the bones still fit together.
He leaned closer, the smell of eucalyptus on him. You should sell while people think you're interesting, before you're just a story about a woman with a flashlight and no plan. Imagine how boring your afternoon will be when I don't. And she turned back to her coffee before her temper unhinged her mouth. Out at the marsh road, cranes leaned against the sky like tired question marks. Owen texted her a photo of the boathouse with a watchman perched on a folding chair like a stork. She returned to the tower where wind had scrubbed Blast clean. It had rained just enough to push the smell of salt into everything. She turned the radio on and let it read to her. A weather service feed droned, small craft advisory by afternoon, pressure falling, a frontal boundary that did not care about fishermen's luck. As if called to witness, gulls circled the river mouth in frantic loops, then finally abandoned the game and arrowed inland. Birds leave early when they can. Humans quote schedules to storms. Down at the bait shop, Miss Lozano's nephew had a radio keyed to Marine Channel 16 and a mouth keyed to worry. People will go out anyway, he told Nyla when she stopped to buy a bottle of water. They say, what's the use of a boat that sits? They say the sky is just practicing again. Give me a list of call signs of the boats that never listen. If they get stubborn, I'll try to be more stubborn. He laughed and handed her a torn notebook page, printed with names like nicknames, Marigold and Me, Two Bucks Luck, Nora K. Like boats were family members you forgave and fed. By noon, the horizon looked bruised. By 2, the wind had a voice you could argue with. At 3, a line of black water advanced like a decision down the river. Nyla climbed and claimed the tower again. She turned on the radios and put the lights to low, a whisper of blue along the runway that felt like setting extra places at a table before you know who is coming. Boats called each other in the language of men who think their own luck is a kind of science. She wrote down their bearings anyway. When Nora K. reported losing an engine and chop that sounded like fists, she felt the tower become more than structure. It became a vantage with responsibility. She keyed the mic on Marine VHF. Nora K., this is Greyvolt Tower on the bluffs by the old field. I have your AIS. I see you. You're drifting north-northeast toward the crab pots that still have their manners. Throw a drogue if you have one. Otherwise, rig a bucket. It doesn't care if you're proud. It cares if you're alive. A startled voice answered. Man from the bait shop, she thought. An uncle or cousin. Who is this? A woman with altitude, she said. Do you have a bucket? They did. It worked, the way physics rewards humility. She guided 2 more boats around a paint-thin shoal she could see from above the way you can see the undercurrent in a conversation when you are not inside the person having it. The storm came like a wall, and then like an argument, and then like grief. Sudden, total, personal. When the emergency call from the clinic hit the air, it arrived with the smell of oxygen. Heli medevac inbound from county, a breathless voice said on public service. Peds trauma with head bleed. Roads blocked on 9A with downed line. Request clear LZ in Greyvolt. The words lifted all the hair on her arms. Nayla punched the airband switch and prayed it wasn't a dead channel. County Hilo, Greyvolt Tower. I can energize runway lights and beacon at the old field. Surface is concrete with some cracked panels. You're heavy? A woman's voice arrived, fried with weather and work. County Hilo says yes, we're heavy, fuel tight. Visibility not our friend. Is that field even real? It is right now, Nayla said. Say souls on board. 3 crew, 1 patient, 1 medic. County Hilo inbound 2 minutes. She threw the runway master and the field washed blue. The beacon spun, faithful now, a teacher's hand sweeping a chalkboard. On Marine, a fisherman swore then blessed her in the same breath. County Hilo's rotors ate distance like a cure eats fear. When the helicopter shouldered through the curtain of rain, it looked both too big and too human. Its landing lights punched color into the storm. Greyvolt, I have you, the pilot said. Wind. Nayla glanced at the windsock she'd stitched crooked that morning and felt a little wild laugh rip up her throat. Call it 20, gusting 30 from the south-southwest. I suggest 15 inbound with a bias to your pride. Copy. Pride isn't worth much in crosswinds. The pilot brought the machine down like a woman returning a borrowed book. Careful, grateful, unsentimental. When the skids touched, a cheer went up in town that Nayla would hear about for years, the day the birdcage lit up for a child the storm tried to take. Owen arrived breathless and drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead like a seal's. He pressed his face to the glass to watch the medic carry the small bundle out. A yellow board, a foam collar, a hand like a leaf. Ms. Lozano stood in the doorway in a raincoat whose pattern had once been daisies and shouted, "Gracias a Dios," to no one and everyone. The helicopter lifted in a plume of spray. When it disappeared into weather heading north, the tower seemed to exhale. Nayla turned the lights down to a hum and leaned her forehead on the cool glass. Her palms shook the way hers always did when the heart remembered what it was for. By evening, the storm had softened to a tantrum. People trickled up to the base of the tower with offerings: thermos soup, a coil of rope, a battery someone thought might fit something. The arclight man appeared with a hand in his pocket and another on his phone, taking photos as if evidence were a toy. "You can't claim this as a helipad. Liability would eat you alive." "I didn't claim anything," Nayla said without looking at him. "A pilot asked for a light in a storm. I gave it." "Your altruism is going to make my life complicated." He smiled to show she should care. "Board meets Friday. They're voting to fast-track our development permit. We're offering to buy your acreage at 3 times assessed value." "Why so generous?" she asked, finally turning to catch his eyes. She wanted to see if he could hold hers. "Because we're good neighbors." He didn't blink. "And because it's cheaper than a fight." "Then you should save money." She put her hands in her pockets so she didn't commit an action her aunties would call a drama. "You'll need it for all the fences you're going to build against everything you set in motion." He shook his head and walked off whistling a tune whose cheer sounded purchased. Nayla went upstairs and wrote in Oswick's logbook like a woman who believed ink could be a kind of vow. "Tower energized for medevac," she printed. "Lights honest, beacon stubborn, people better than rumor." She slept on the cot with the radio low. When a noise woke her, she couldn't name it at first. The room had its storms and its rats and its distant boilerplate creaks. This sound was neither. It was a note in the air like a coin spun on a counter until it stopped. A small, insistent, almost silence where something had just been. She sat up. The tower felt like a held breath. Even the old winds through the window seemed to lean in to hear something she couldn't yet. On the airband, the bottle wind tone arrived again, long enough to be a signature. Then a voice rode in on it, thin, cautious, the way people talk when they're certain no one is listening and hope someone is anyway. "Gray Vault Field. If you were operational, advise." Nayla's mouth went dry. She keyed the mic and tasted the courage of every woman who ever picked up a tool that hadn't been handed to her. "Gray Vault Tower is manned," she said softly, like she might spook the voice. "State your intentions. Request lighting and approach for an unscheduled stop. We are heavy, we are quiet, we need a place to be neither. For a minute." She paused long enough to hear how badly she wanted to say yes to any voice that made itself vulnerable in this room. Say call sign. Silence like a decision someone did not want to make. Then, Horizon Flight 17. Horizon was a charter outfit out of the city that flew politicians when they needed to get to photo ops before the weather remembered they were human. Her heart did an algebra without permission. If Horizon was inbound in a storm, after dark, to a closed field, it meant something with teeth was nipping at credibility somewhere. She stood so quickly the stool scraped. The beacon controls were at her left hand, the master for the runway lights at her right. Between them, the tower felt suddenly too small for the decision crouching inside it. "Say call sign," she said, "because if you make the decision human, you are less likely to lie about it to yourself later." A new voice, hoarse, impatient, older, cut in. "2 crew, 5 passengers. We're time critical." The tone on crew sounded like cheap respect. "State nature of your critical." "Medical. And, custody transfer." The words woke something old inside the tower, the way certain phrases wake dogs or rivers. Out at the North Pier, faint lights moved where there shouldn't be movement. 3 trucks came down from the marsh road and took their places like pieces on a board. Her scalp prickled. From above, patterns betray themselves. The trucks weren't guarding, they were pointing.
"Gray Vault," the hoarse voice said. "Lights!" It didn't ask, it assumed. It assumed people like her didn't stand in front of systems and say no. She put a hand on the beacon switch and didn't throw it. Instead, she turned to the whiteboard and drew the airfield, runway like a spine, approach from the south over town roofs. If they landed heavy on concrete that hadn't been certified in a decade, it could hold. Or it could take a knee at 60 knots and turn history into an obituary that named people who once practiced laughs. She keyed the mic and kept her voice level. "Horizon 17, say type." 7-3, we don't have the patience for rural drama." 737. Her mouth went cold. That wasn't just heavy, that was arrogance with wings. She looked out across the runway to where the old test pit yawned like a bad memory. If they set down with a margin for error measured in prayers, if the tires met a panel that owed too much to freeze-thaw, if history chose that moment to remind everyone who really writes it. "Say again," she said, not trusting her ears or the room. 7-3, no serviceable alternates within fuel." The voice took a breath, then threw a doctrine at her like a brick at a window. "This message constitutes a declaration." On Marine, someone shouted. On Owen's private channel, a drone's whine rose. He'd launched without asking because he was 16 and certain that anything he could see, he could save. The arc-light trucks at the pier adjusted their positions like bricks discovering they were a wall. "Who are your passengers?" Nyla asked, and hated herself for wanting to know when the knowing wouldn't change the math. Silence. Then, "State official," the first voice said quietly. "Plus protection, plus 1 journalist, plus a child." Her hand found the console as if gravity had changed. She thought of the council president's renderings and the way he glowed like a street lamp. She thought of Miss Lozano's sister dancing under the lights in '86. She thought of Osric drawing a lantern on a map like a man who loved being practical about romance. If she lit the field, she might be abetting a quiet, private arrival that would slide between pages of the public record like a ring slipped off before a handshake. If she refused, a plane might arc out over the river and break into a story people would speak about with the words, "I remember where I was when." "Nyla," Owen's voice cracked over the local frequency he'd stolen from a cheap walkie. He never used her name on air. "They're setting up cars on the old service road, like they want to escort somebody or trap somebody or both. They have vests with words that look like authority and eyes that look like rules made for someone else." "Get down," she said, and her voice did that thing it did when her fear felt like electricity. He obeyed so quickly she tasted gratitude like rain. "Gray Vault," the hoarse voice insisted. "We are on final." She could see it then, a smear of light in the murk, the brief wink of a strobe, the big, slow dignity of a machine that believed itself inevitable. It lined up over town roofs where laundry lines sung and garden gnomes endured,
and a life without this decision had been happening seconds ago. She rested her fingers on the master switch for the runway lamps and the beacon toggle and the emergency field flood. 3 choices, like 3 sentences diverging. "This is Horizon 17 on a 3-mile final," the softer voice said, urgency unspooling into something like plea. "Grant us the lights, Greyvault. Don't make us land into a mirror." Nyla looked down one last time at the North Pier. The trucks had moved again. Not guarding, still pointing. They pointed like coordinates at a section of fence that last week hadn't existed, at a gate that led to a service road that led to the tower that was about to become a historical fact one way or another. She placed her palm flat on the panel, feeling the faint vibration of a system that was asking her to choose what sort of story it wanted to tell the next 5 minutes. "Greyvault Tower," she said into the mic, and in the high room her voice sounded like a bell calling the honest to witness. "Stand by." The plane's landing lights bloomed larger. The storm took a breath. The town held one too. Nyla hooked her fingers under the edge of the master switch, met her own eyes in the reflection on the glass. Small, fierce, suddenly as old as her choices, and pulled.
From below, horns answered like a flock. The town had waited for practical instructions long enough. Given something useful to do in a story bigger than gossip, they spilled their stubbornness onto gravel and fence line. Maris, she decided on the name and let it anchor. Came back on. Greyvault, confirming. Proceed to runway end, no left turn, stand fast until further. Correct, and switch your transponder to ident. Why? The hoarse voice demanded. So the sky can point at you, she said. And so that when people ask whether you existed, there is a record that says yes. The ident blinked on her receiver. In the window's rain, a pair of landing lights became an intention. The jet's whiteness, briefly glimpsed through murk, looked like belief trying to keep a promise. "Wind 230 at 30, Nayla said. "Gusts remain ugly but not vindictive. You're a dot high. Lose 5 knots of ego." Maris laughed, short, sincere, scared. "Roger, ego -5. Short of the threshold, there's a patch where freeze-thaw taught concrete bad ideas. Aim a hair beyond the numbers. Not enough to write a poem about. Just enough you'll be able to call your mother." The rain was a curtain being convinced to open. The jet emerged on short final, its lights eating slices of weather. For a moment, the town held only one thought, a line and a weight and a place to put. Nayla leaned both palms on the console, as if she could steady the weather. Above the town, gulls startled in the rain, anxious brightnesses. She saw something she could not unsee, a loop drawn across the map in a hand she didn't trust, the airfield and the pier and the road forming a private circuit where public truth should go. A child moved like cargo, a journalist trapped where curiosity becomes insurance, an official using weather as cover and a closed field as a broom closet. The tower had given her height. The town had given her audience. Together, they could give a future a different first page. "Owen," she said on the local channel. "Calm down," she told her pulse. "Speed is not courage. Get me a shot of those trucks with plates visible. Get me the faces with the paperwork. Keep your distance. If one of them blinks hard, you run like you invented it." "On it," he said. The drone lifted in the rain with a brave little whine that made her chest ache. She keyed airband again. "Horizon 17, here is what is going to happen if you want my lights. You will power down your left engine. You will open your right side door only. You will allow the medic to disembark with the child. The medic will proceed with the child in the clear corridor of cameras to the ambulance I have just requested. The journalist will walk with them. The official can step into the rain and wait with us like any man who believes the law is on his side."
"That's not how this works," the hoarse voice snapped. "That's not your decision." "Every decision is mine up here," she said, so quietly the room leaned in to hear her. That's what a tower is. A place where someone is trusted to make decisions across other people's noise. You don't have to like it. You just have to decide whether to be grateful later. Below, Auntie Lozano's phalanx formed. A bright corridor of phones held high, their screens glowing in the rain like a constellation someone had asked for. The ambulance's siren arrived over the wind, like scent supplied to panic. County deputies rolled up with their lights on and their uncertainty visible. A sergeant conferred with the men at the truck, and then with the crowd, and then, finally, with the tower by looking up like a man who'd forgotten roofs have ears. She switched to the county frequency. "Sergeant, this is the tower. I have a recording of an attempted off-record transfer involving a minor and a state official. I have 3 trucks staging at a private gate. I have 1 jet on my runway because I let it, and I can turn off the lights if anyone disobeys me." "Who the hell are you?" the sergeant asked, not angry so much as dizzy. "Nayla Quaid, owner and controller pro tem of Grey Vault's Old Field. Check your code book. You'll find that the person in this position gets to be extremely annoying when she's right." A beat. Then he huffed a sound that might have been a laugh. "Copy, Miss Quaid. We'll do it your way. For now." "Good. It's the safe way. It's the recorded way. It's the way the child won't have to carry with them like a secret they didn't choose." At the fence end, the men from the truck hesitated in the rain, while a gimbal-stable drone looked down at them like impartial judgment. Then one of them squared his shoulders, produced a wallet with credentials inside, and walked toward the ambulance with his hands open and his mouth align. That was the thing about public. It made men practice sincerity. "Maris," she said again, now only for the cockpit, as if they were 2 women holding a ladder steady between them. "What do you need to comply with this without losing your job?" "Something official, something that says the county took custody." "You'll have it when the sergeant signs. Keep your CVR rolling, keep your FOQA logs honest. If you're asked later whether you were coerced by a woman with lights, you say yes and you say thank you." A long breath came over the frequency. Then Maris, right engine to idle, right door opening. She watched, through rain and distance, as the jet's right door yawned like a held tongue showing itself. A medic stepped carefully into the wet with a small shape in his arms, blue blanket, pale hand. The child's face was turned inward toward the medic's waterproof jacket, like someone listening to a secret. Behind them, a woman in a raincoat with hair like a question emerged. The journalist, phone already up, recording. The official hesitated at the door, a tall silhouette caught between privileges. Then he stepped back into the cabin's dim and stayed there where the cameras could not immediately argue with him. At the fence, the phones held high did not jeer. They filmed, quietly. The corridor of aunties did what aunties do when a child appears and the world is wrong. They widened their shoulders and softened their faces. The medic moved quickly. The child's hand twitched, then clenched, then relaxed around the edge of the blanket as if deciding to be here. The journalist kept pace, biting her lip, broadcasting. A deputy put his hat on the child, as if ritual could be made up on the spot. The ambulance doors took the small body in. The medic turned and lifted a thumb toward the tower, like a signal to a captain on a bridge. The journalist stepped close to the open door and said something into the lens that made the stream's comments explode into words that felt like a town remembering its spine. "County has custody," the sergeant said, into his radio, into hers. "Signing chain complete."
"Good," she said. "Make him walk the corridor like everyone else." He did. Cameras recorded. The coat's shoulder went from nice to wet in increments you could graph. At the end of the corridor, a deputy held the door of a cruiser open like a doorman at a hotel the rain couldn't afford. The official hesitated for a long blink
and then folded himself into the back seat like travel had finally happened to him. Gray Vault, the careful voice again. Inbound is diverting. There was relief he did not know he had permission to admit. We will debrief later. Bring coffee when you do, she said, and a notarized apology. The turboprop's lights swung away and thinned. The night settled on the field like a hand removing weight from a shoulder. The ambulance left under lights, without siren, a dignified choice that made Nayla love the sergeant in a quiet way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with a category of men who understand the difference between drama and help. Quaid? Ms. Lozano's voice. You can breathe now. Nayla had not realized she'd stopped. She pulled air into herself like a woman surfacing from deep water. Her knees weakened as if the walls had scooped some of her strength and stored it for tomorrow. She reached for the logbook. Oshric deserved an entry. Field reopened for truth, she wrote. Jet arrived heavy with consequences. Child safe. Witnessing sufficient. Owen crept into the cab as if he were entering a chapel. His hair stuck up in defiance of any storm. He smelled like rain and battery and youth. He looked at her like he'd stumbled across a new species of adult and wanted to believe it wasn't endangered. You did it, he said. We did it, she corrected, and we recorded it so it stays real when the rain dries. He flopped onto the ripped cushion stool and spun it idly with a foot, then caught himself like doing so was a disrespect to the room. Chat says they're calling you the birdcage keeper. She winced and laughed. As long as they don't call me bird brain, I'll manage. He held up his phone. The feed replayed on a loop. The jet, the corridor of phones, the child's small hand, the official's coat sagging, the sergeant's signature. Comments climbed into a place where people go when they've watched something and want to feel the way it made them feel again. There's a message request from the journalist. She wants to come up. Let her, she said, but make her climb. He grinned and vanished down the stairs. Nayla looked out at the field. The jet sat like a sheep that had wandered into a better pen. County had taped off the service gate. The trucks idled without purpose. On the fence line, aunties hugged and scolded each other for getting wet without scarves. It looked like a harvest turned inside out. Gratitude gathered, rain the combine. The journalist arrived out of breath and narrow as a question mark. She held her phone damp in her hand and her eyes wider than television ever allows. You're the reason I'm still employed, the journalist said, panting, half laughing. If we'd landed without witnesses, I would have been put in a car with tinted glass and told my presence violated something invented an hour ago. I'm Naylor, she said, and held out a hand in a room that had begun to revert to being a room. You okay? I'm complicated, but yes. My name's Sierra. She turned her phone's camera toward the window and filmed the field from above like proof from a second angle. Do you realize what this will do? Nayla watched the North Pier. Trucks had given up pretending to be corrals and were hugging the gate like dogs whose owners had been told to sit. I realized that a story happened where we could see, and that stories happening where we can see is a kind of infrastructure. Sierra made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a sob that had to put on boots. I was embedded with him all day. He said he wanted transparency. He meant windows with curtains you can pull if weather shows up. How did the child end up on your plane? Add-on, Sierra said, anger gathering in her like static. An aide handed me a revised manifest after we were taxiing and said it was a courtesy. A courtesy of what kind of state? They tried to bury a person in administrative language? She looked around the cab like she needed something to hold that wasn't electronic. And you, Nayla finished for her, owned the switch. It wasn't as noble as you're about to make it sound. I just am taller than I was yesterday. Sierra put her phone down and met Nayla's eyes with a force that felt like two ropes thrown from one ship to another. You changed the story's altitude. That's not small. They stood in the hummed quiet where large moments cool. Down at the ramp, Maris and her captain were conferring with County. The captain, hoarse voice, was smaller out of the radio as everyone is. He looked like a man who would make jokes about airline coffee and apologize to passengers for turbulence as if he had personally offended the clouds. Maris looked exactly like her voice, steadying. She raised her hand toward the tower. Nayla raised hers back. It felt absurd and exactly correct. Miss Quaid, the sergeant again, this time on the stair, hat under his arm, rein on his shoulders. Up close he was younger than his voice and older than his eyes. "Thank you," he said, it awkwardly as if it were a weapon he wasn't used to laying down. "You did the necessary, which is rarer than heroics and more useful." He flushed, then remembered he had errands. "You gonna keep this place lit?" he asked, gesturing to the field and the town and the little patch of history they had leaned into together. "Only when it tells the truth," she said. He nodded as if that was an answer they'd both practice. "County'll have questions about permits, state will have questions about you." She smiled without softness. Let them climb the stairs if they want answers. He laughed. He left. Sierra filmed him leaving, then turned the camera back on Nayla like a cat that had discovered the warmest spot in a house. "Tell me about Osric," she said. Nayla felt the familiar ache move over her in a wave that did not threaten to drown. "He left me the keys to a thing people forgot mattered. I don't know if that's love or mischief." "Both," Sierra said. "Always both." They stood in silence until the rain tired of being stubborn. The town, drunk on adrenaline and relief, flowed down the fence like a party that knew it wasn't that. Miss Lozano sent a nephew with soup that tasted like being chosen. Owen declared he would sleep on the floor under the console to guard against imaginary invaders and real forgetting. Maris and the captain came up the tower on tired legs to shake Nayla's hand and say words that sounded less like thanks and more like promises about how they'd fly tomorrow. When at last the field quieted, jet dark, Trex gone, county tape bright as morning thinking in the beacon's off-light, Nayla sat on the stool and let Sierra ask questions into her phone. Not journalism, so much as a witness making sure the room would still exist when the video finished uploading.
"What happens next?" Sierra asked finally. "Next," Nayla said, "I fix the elevator." She smiled at Sierra's face. "And the runway signs, and the east windows, and maybe whatever made the bottle wind sound all week." Sierra leaned forward. "What was that?" Nayla told her about the tone, the pattern, the way it preceded the ERJ's first call. Sierra frowned. "A handshake," she said, "an off-book code between ground and air to keep civilians from listening properly." She looked out at the field. "You listened anyway." "I have altitude," Nayla said, "and curiosity." "That's going to make you dangerous," Sierra murmured, not unkindly. "I hope it makes me useful," Nayla replied. They fell asleep for a while in the cab, Sierra on the floor, wrapped in a borrowed blanket that smelled like coiled wire, Owen under the console with his drone cradled like a cat, Nayla on the ripped cushion with the logbook open under her hand like a prayer someone else had begun and she was obligated to finish. They woke to sun making hard decisions through stubborn clouds. Greyvault's roofs steamed. The marsh smelled like a choice. The tower's glass held fingerprints like signatures. Cars honked small, grateful honks to the tower as if it were a person returning from the hospital. A child's drawing appeared taped to the base door, a stick figure woman next to a tall box with shining windows, a little ambulance, a plane that looked like a goose. The caption dictated to a reluctant adult, "Thank you, Sky Lady." "God help you," Sierra said, laughing softly as she filmed the drawing. "The internet will tattoo that under your name." "Let it. Better than bird brain." Before noon, the county council called an emergency session whose emergency was the fact that their emergency had been handled without them. ArcLight released a statement so bland it could double as drywall. The state official's office released another with the word transparency in it 3 times. Sierra's piece went live with the headline, "Some lights should stay on." Owen's stream, clipped and remixed and captioned in 6 languages by people who didn't owe Greyvault anything, ran under it like a river.
By late afternoon, the caution tape around the new gate at the North Pier was gone. Trucks did not line up like prayers. A man in a polo walked the perimeter with a clipboard and the face of someone who thought he'd be promoted for yesterday and was being taught the word consequence instead. Miss Lozano sat on a milk crate and watched him with the patience of continence. Every time he looked up and caught her eye, he flinched as if he'd met a doctrine he wasn't authorized to interpret. For all the big noises, statements, and headlines and men in ties, the most important confirmation arrived quiet. The county child welfare office called Lozano's shop looking for the woman at the tower, and then, when connected to the right stubbornness, said, "The child is stable. The bleed was caught in time. The foster home is a good one. We wanted you to know." Nayla stood very still, with the phone to her ear, and felt something unclench in you could only find by its absence. "Thank you," she said. She leaned into the concrete wall as if the tower and she were objects meant to prop each other. "Thank you." The line of days that followed did not return to any old normal. People came to the tower with favors and petitions and casseroles. Teenagers climbed the stairs because the internet said they should. Older men who had once flown Club Cessnas brought boxes of manuals like offerings to a temple that had rediscovered its god. A retired controller from a bigger, less forgiving field drove out with a toolbox and the expression of a man meeting a daughter he didn't know existed, skeptical, tender, doomed to care. He introduced himself as Kurt. He moved through the cab with professional blasphemy, muttering at panel labels, blessing the stubborn switches with exactly the right amount of profanity. "You got no tower authority," he said, half compliment, half curse, which is to say, all compliment. "You got a town." "A town is harder to lose," she said. He snorted like a man who had tried. Together, they tuned the radios until they sounded like they remembered their own names. He taught her a handful of arcane light gun signals and where to find the box of paddles that Osric had used to wave in crop dusters 27 years ago when Greyvault had spent a summer believing in aerial spraying for mosquitoes and a winter wondering why the fish were wrong. They argued for an hour about the beacon, her wanting to use it as punctuation, him wanting it steady as a heartbeat. They compromised the way you do when neither person wants to win. They wrote a protocol in the logbook so another day wouldn't have to reinvent their homework. The state sent a letter about permits. Arclight sent a man who wore a smile with a hinge in it to ask if she'd consider a generous offer for the property in the interest of regional development. She stood with him at the base of the tower and asked him to look up. He did. His face did not know how to have that angle while lying. "Looks good on your Instagram," he said finally. "Not everything is a symbol." "Everything is a symbol and a system. That's the trouble with truth. It multitasks." Sierra kept reporting. Her follow-up piece showed Kurt's hands on the dials like a benediction, and Miss Lozano's aunties at the fence like a chorus, and Owen teaching other kids how to fly drones without scaring birds. The state's official's office tried a second statement that said the child's transfer had been miscommunicated and would be reviewed by a committee with a name so stern it sounded like a locker. People posted the clip of the corridor and the hat and the small hand twice as much in response. The story was not moving on. It was landing repeatedly, like a training pattern that made a pilot honest. A week later, on a morning clear enough to mistake for mercy, the bottle wind tone touched the air again. Nayla looked up from the whiteboard where she'd been beginning to draw a map for a community open day, bring your lawn chairs, meet your radios, and felt the old prickle. "Greyvault Tower. Go ahead," Tower, this is Maris," the soft voice said, and the way it filled the room made Nayla grin before she remembered to be an adult. "Hello? How's your captain's voice?" "Less hoarse," Maris laughed. "He's giving interviews about procedural integrity." "And you?" "Looking at other jobs," Maris admitted. "Ones where integrity is not a surprise." "Wanted to tell you, the official resigned." Nayla stood very still. She tried on several feelings. The one that fit best was not triumph, but relief shaped like opportunity. Good. Now maybe the next one will understand Windows. Also, Maris added, smile audible, the child's foster parent asked if they could send a drawing. I told them to mail it to the birdcage lady. The post office knew. They always do. Nayla, tears surprising her. She blinked them down the way you do when your throat is already full of the day's jobs. Maris signed off with a click that felt like friendship promising to return by a route it liked. Nayla stood and went to the window. From up here, Greyvault looked like a place that wanted to keep trying and would, even when the weather and the money and the men in suits came to remind it that trying is not a business model. She put her palm on the glass in the sun and let the heat from outside and the cool from inside find each other under her skin. Kurt came up the stairs with a stack of placards under one arm and a smirk that had learned generosity. Made you some light gun cheat sheets for the kids. Also found a second-hand windsock that isn't an embarrassment.
"Bless you," she said. He shrugged. "You're the one doing the blessing around here." He hesitated, then added in the voice of a man who has lost and is learning how to admit it, "You know you changed things, right?" "I know we recorded them," she said, "and that might be enough." He looked around the room, at the dials and the map and the silly lantern and Osric's pencil, at the whiteboard with the corridored fence and the crooked windsock drawn too lovingly, at Syrah asleep in the corner again after a night editing, at Owen snoring on the floor like a dog with a full heart. "It is," he said simply. "Sometimes." They ran the open day like a gentle emergency. Half the town came, the other half waved from porches and promised to bring pie next time. Kids tried on headsets and said, "Say again" to each other in voices that made their parents laugh and their grandparents cry. Someone brought an old tower clock that had been rescued from a maintenance shed and set to rights. Coot taught toddlers how to point the signal light without blinding the gulls. Miss Luzano sold empanadas from a cooler and told people stories about herself that were partially true and entirely useful. Near the end of the day, a man in a polite suit with a notepad and a face that could learn stood by the console and asked Nayla what policy she would write if she could only write one. "Make altitude a public utility," she said. And before he could turn that into a metaphor or a cudgel, she explained. "Give communities vantage. Put towers on their schools, not for planes, but for patterns. Train a generation to look from above and say, that line of trucks doesn't make sense for fuel. Teach them that seeing is not the same as dreaming. Teach them that some lies can't stand the angle." The man wrote quickly, then slowly, then closed his book like a priest after a confession he was going to try hard to remember. That night, when the light was turned down to the low hum that felt like faith at rest, Nayla climbed to the highest rung of the tower's catwalk and looked out at everything she had been allowed to witness. The runway lay like a quiet premise. The pier glinted without malice. The service road was empty of intention. The marsh breathed, patient as moss. Syrah came up beside her and bumped shoulders. "You know this isn't over," she said. "It never is. That's why towers were invented, not to end things, to keep watch while they try again."
Somewhere, a gull cried like an old hinge. Somewhere else, a radio crackled with men asking each other where they'd left the socket set. Somewhere below, Owen laughed in his sleep and a drone dreamed about flying without weather. Above everything, the stars practiced being steady. Nayla went down into the cab and wrote one last entry in the logbook for the day. She used Osric's pencil because it was blunt and honest. Tower purpose confirmed. Altitude loaned to town. History changed by witnessing. Recommend sunrise. She closed the book, set it by the window, and sat quietly while the room cooled. She thought about the child in a different bed than the one planned for them, about the official learning that light is not hostile, it is just uninterested in stories that don't invite it, about Maris looking for new work, about Owen with a future wider than a service road, about Miss Luzano and her phalanx of aunties who had discovered their phones were not only for grandchildren and recipes, but also for bending policy in the rain. What she saw from above that first night, trucks arranged like sentences, a jet pretending to be larger than it was, a town discovering it owned a lens, had not merely saved a person or embarrassed a man. It had taught Greyvault something that would be far more dangerous to the next convenient secret: how to get tall together. Below, in the dark, someone taped a second drawing to the base of the tower. Two figures this time, their hands connected, one tall and square, one small with a hat too big. The tower was a rectangle with a crown. The caption, "We saw." She smiled until her cheeks hurt. She stood, breathed the room in, and began shutting things down, not to abandon them, but to teach them how to sleep without fear. Radios to low, beacon to off, edge lights to traces that would make foxes braver. She gathered cups and pens and the stubborn hearts that people leave behind. At the door, she paused, put her palm to the concrete like a secular benediction. "Guard them," she said to the building and to herself. "Guard the angle." The tower said nothing, as is the way of good structures. It stood, and would stand. And in that standing was the promise that the next time the bottle wind tone arrived, or the convoy's geometry betrayed itself, or the weather came mean, or someone tried to quietly move a life across the map, someone would be here to say, "I see you. I have altitude. Come into the light, or go find some place with shorter stairs." She stepped into the night, into the town that was both smaller and bigger than anyone had admitted yesterday, and locked the door behind her, not to keep anyone out, but to mark the miracle that now there was a door to lock it all.